Hello and welcome to Varmblog. And today we're actually talking about something close to my day job, which is public education and its funding. I'm here with Dr. David I. Backer, Associate Professor of Education Policy at Seton Hall University, author of, I believe, 4 books, Elements of Discussion, The Golden and Roast, Althusser for Educators, Althusser in Education, Reassessing Critical Education, and then most recently and pertinent to our discussion here, As Public as Possible, Radical Finance for America's Schools, plural, not singular. I know Dr. Backer's work actually separately. I realized I'd read your work on Althusser and pedagogy separately from reading your more recent work on educational finance, and had not put that it was the same person together.
That's so cool. Well, I mean, thanks for having me on. It was the invitation. It's great to be here with you. I'm a big fan of how you mix all these things together, and it's so cool. I mean, you're one of the very few people, if I can think of any, who had encountered my work on Althusser, and then I could imagine, that there's a bit of dissonance between those two.
Yeah, a little bit. Although, as a person who has been thinking about public education for now 20 years, and I am in the unenviable place of being a teacher leader, which means that I have responsibility but no power.
Right.
And I understand, unlike a lot of my colleagues and comrades, how schools are laid out and how they function and how their finances go, but again, have no control over them. And realized a long time ago how much they varied from state to state. So you wrote As Public as Possible last year. What got you interested from moving from kind of abstract pedagogy to very specific policy?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, particularly your little anecdote of not realizing that it's the same person writing these books. I mean, the thing is, I was a high school teacher first. I mean, I studied philosophy, as an undergraduate, philosophy, mathematics, actually, and then I was a high school teacher. And there was something about the combination of teaching in high school and having studied philosophy and thinking about philosophy in the classroom as I was becoming a teacher. I actually taught in a Catholic school for my first time teaching, and they really, depending on the school you're at in particular, they'll let you do whatever. And I I found myself drawing from the philosophy to do stuff, if that makes sense. To really, it wasn't just about what Sartre said or what Frege said or whatever. It was actually about what they said and what it meant for me in the classroom with my students and my response to them. And philosophy was really about how to increase the possibilities, widen the horizons and the imagination when it comes to practice. And which is why when I encountered Paulo Freire and the theory of praxis and stuff, I found it very compelling later on. But I was always interested in the ways in which the concepts lived, if that makes sense. The ways in which they activated the world. And, when I got involved in organizing and movements when I was a teacher, and then after that, I really found that, drawing from philosophy again, kept helping me. But when I was in the movements, particularly in Philadelphia, I was finishing up this project on Althusser when I got this first tenure track job. I was at a place called Westchester University. I was living in Philly. I was involved with the education movements there in Philadelphia, and what they were super concerned with was the state of the buildings and the toxic school buildings in the city. A teacher had sort of infamously been diagnosed and then would later die of mesothelioma from untreated asbestos in the school buildings, and there had been decades of organizing around it. And I, got involved with these coalitions who were demanding more funding for the buildings. And so I'd gotten this job, and I was actually beginning to teach classes in policy. And I was trying to think to myself, like, what would be an interesting topic to teach on at a high level, at the doctoral level in education policy, what would be cool to apply Althusser to in a way, but also what would be helpful for the movements. And I realized, I mean, I'd sort of been wanting to, as someone who studies Marxism, critical theory, political economy, like obviously get really deep into the numbers and finance and stuff, but I hadn't taken that deep dive. I was like, well, I actually don't understand how the money even works. Like, if I'm organizing a campaign and I need to fix something up in the school building or whatever, and I'm demanding more money, who exactly controls that money and how? Where does it flow? How does it flow? And I was just like, wouldn't it be kind of wild? Wouldn't it be kind of unexpected or messed up if I just started reading finance and school finance and getting involved in finance? I mean, I found that a lot of people didn't understand. And I found that I could be helpful as a writer, as a thinker, as someone involved in the movements, but also as someone with a lot of time as a researcher to devote myself to figuring this stuff out publicly. So I just started keeping a newsletter, and it was the shutdowns of 2020. And my partner was pregnant at the time. I was looking for a way to distract myself from everything that was going on, and I just started going in real deep. And I think the Althusserian theory really lends itself to that kind of work, actually, to going very, very fine grained into the social structure, because that theory is one about uneven development. It's about contradiction. It's about at the level of practice and like the effectivity of the forces of certain actions and complexity and stuff. And I found that the school finance was a very fascinating area, but it also it scratched an itch for me, because going way back I had an interest in mathematics and numbers and that kind of thing. So it made sense to me to make that change, but it is a pretty far jump.
Yeah. As a person who my story is actually in some ways similar to yours. I even taught abroad for a long time. I've worked in public schools, private schools, charter schools. Now I'm at a fully online, fully public, not a charter school. I could talk, I don't want to get too into that because it's risking time my day job in, but education funding struck me a long time ago. I taught during the Great Recession. That's when I actually started. I moved from being an adjunct professor and a community college lecturer into being a public school teacher and a community college lecturer in 2007. And I saw the finances of schools fall apart, and we dealt with absurdities about finance lines, and they vary greatly from state to state. But, we had a property tax line for staffing, which is 93% of most schools' cost.
Yep.
But then we had a separate line for building funds, both local, but they came out of different sectors of taxation. So one came out of property taxes.
Flows.
Yeah. And then the buildings came out of sales tax. And we could, yeah. And what I very quickly saw there is in 2009, we had to open schools that we could not staff because we had the building allocations, but no staffing allocations for them.
Right.
And there was no way to fix this because property taxes were tanking, and we were legally prohibited from asking for a temporary sales tax for staffing. It's just not legal in the state.
What state were you in?
I was in Georgia.
You're in Georgia. Okay, interesting. Yeah, Georgia does the SPLOT, the penny sales tax thing.
Right. Well, I now currently am a public school teacher in Utah, and the structure is completely different.
Very different.
We do still primarily fund on property taxes, but the property tax decision makers are actually, interestingly, school boards who do not correspond in the main to either a municipal or county level government.
Right. They're their own fourth thing.
Right. Their own fourth thing, which then also means it's harder to organize to alter them in any way. So it's much harder for there to be community engagement to push on, say, a administration or a school board or a super, because in Georgia we got rid, the community actually chased supers off. That does not happen in Utah, partly because of the way the urban districts have structured their school districts and property tax boundaries, where they don't correspond, usually, there's a few exceptions, with any other form of government. We also fund schooling through an equalization at the state level per student. It's this thing called FTE,
Yep.
which we did not have in Georgia. And that is slightly more, weirdly, it is slightly more progressive than the Georgia model, but we still have many problems that replicate the Georgia model, because it is still the richer schools that get more FTE.
Right.
So and that's just two models. I'm also familiar with Pennsylvania, where you used to live, which has a completely different funding model, but it's still local.
Yeah.
I do think people realize what your first chapter is about. I do think most people understand now, because even liberals get it, that like local funding of education replicates class and racial biases in almost in extreme, and makes it to where it even affects property values in a major way. It's school value and property value are tied together, so even free public education becomes a class good, like a private education would. So but you argue that this isn't an accident. This is not I'm from the South. I'm pretty sure it isn't an accident, but some of the worst examples of this actually aren't in the Southeast, because there was priorly some mitigation by civil rights law, but in New York, where it's like extreme. So how do you think this developed, and like, what does this tell you about the way we fund public services in general?
Yeah, well, the way it's developed, it's a very long, complicated story that I don't definitely fully I mean, I have to say, I don't fully understand everything about school finance. I have to say, a lot of my work is sort of publicly saying that I'm like just trying to understand myself, because the stuff is so complicated and uneven. The story that I tell of the local funding, thinking about local funding, the story that I tell in the book is one that involves like a few ingredients, and the first ingredient is really the property tax, which develops actually as a kind of working class, like white working class demand in the mid 19th century, early 19th century, to try to combat a previous, actually much more unequal way of funding schools through rate bills, at trying to have people had to like declare themselves poor and then pay tuition into a state program that then funded this sets of schools, like poor schools basically. And the property tax was kind of seen as this like almost redistributive thing that was going to take up and take on like sort of powerful property holding people to be able to provide education for everyone, whether you had property or not. And the thing is that property tax was collected at the state level. Okay, so it was collected and then redistributed accordingly. But Matthew Gardner Kelly, this historian, just published this great book called "Dividing the Public." He tells a history, at least in California and in the West, of how the local property tax became the local property tax and not the state property tax, which is to say, localities started to say, we want to collect our own tax to fund our own education. We don't want to be told by the state what to do with the money that we're allotted. We want to raise what we want to raise and do with it what we want to do. And at a certain point, most property taxes for education were collected by the state at the state level. Now, it is interesting to note historically that taxes on property to fund education go way back, at least to like what was before it was Germany, like a series of kingdoms in Germany during the Protestant Revolution. It was the Protestants that really thought, that there should be schools, and that those schools should be teaching everyone to read so they could read the Bible. And also, as Germany was becoming like a nation, they thought, okay, we're going to fund we're going to use a property tax for it, which actually then goes back. Property taxes to pay for public services goes back, in European history to Rome and Greece at the very. So this is like an old practice. Even the Puritans, in colonial United States and the colonies were trying to tax property to fund their public schools to comply with this law they passed called the Old Deluder Satan Act in 1647, which was it was passed because they wanted people to go to school so that they wouldn't be deluded by Satan. Okay, this practice goes back a long time, but I'm jumping around. After the property tax is collected by the state, localities start to want to have that power. And that is sort of parallel with the home rule charter movement, which also happens in the mid 19th century, where suburbs who are within the orbit of large cities want to be able to control their finances municipally more. They want to have city charters. And as like localities sort of rise in power, get their own city charters, they start demanding to pay for their own municipal services like education. And then in California, the first ever proposition after California adopted this sort of prop system, where you could vote on referenda like that. The first one ever in California was to devolve the right of collecting the property tax to the local school district away from the state, and it passed. And that was, I think, 1901. So I think this structure, and then those school district lines, those are also very old. The way that they're drawn, but then when they're redrawn, it really gets to some of the stuff, very tense elements of our social structure. And essentially, since the civil rights movement, there was a kind of first civil rights movement in Reconstruction after the Civil War. And a lot of in the South, speaking of the South and the Southeast, a lot of the school finance structures that you have in place there are as a result of Reconstruction, specifically the coterminous boundaries of school districts and counties and the power of the county government in determining things having to do with school finances. It was thought that if you prevented small little school districts from forming and then becoming these kind of fortresses that you could help integrate so by keeping it to the whole county. And but then in the second big civil rights movement, there was this legal strategy that was sort of championed by the NAACP to take it to the courts, say this violates the 14th Amendment, the way that this all works out with the local property tax. They're sort of defeated at the federal level, the Supreme Court, but then they have a series of significant victories at the state level thereafter. And state governments start collecting more money, largely through sales taxes, to try to compensate for the huge inequalities that we're seeing. And states have surpassed the localities by a point or two on average, providing for a public education. I think as a result of that civil rights strategy. But like those averages and the way that right wingers will try to say, like, oh, well, the inequalities of property taxes are no longer relevant because of the state governments, like the averages really hide very unequal situations, because a district with high property values only has to tax a little bit to get a whole lot. They don't need money from the state. But the next door district that's been deindustrialized, that's mostly diverse working class, they have to tax 10 times higher to get 10 times less money, and they need a ton of help from the state, and it's still not enough. And the federal government's essentially out to lunch. It's been that way, basically the whole of the system. It's an extremely decentralized system. That's my understanding. That's how we got to where we are now, where we have significant state contributions that don't compensate for the inequalities of that previous fully local system that itself had been actually a state level system that was more redistributive, that was dismantled by this sort of movement of local control in the mid 19th century.
Yeah, I think that's actually really really important to point out. I was actually very interested when I was studying the Common School movement way back with Horace Mann. That yes, he wanted property taxes based off the Prussian model because we seem to have, yes, we have the Puritan and the English model in our schools, but a lot of our schools even are, down to kindergarten, are based off the German Prussian model. That's what Horace Mann was really modeling things after. That's for good and ill, but it was very public minded. And I remember being surprised that it was a statewide property tax, initially. I believe the very first pushback on that was actually in Pennsylvania in like the early mid 1800s. And then, it was not completely really crushed to the 20th century, as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
To explain to people how we did things before that, it was it was even more piecemeal. You had a user fee model. I think you mentioned this in your book.
Yep.
Which was, you basically pay to play. It was like a tuition charged to parents based on how many school days they attended. I remember like reading some Southern literature from the 19th century and them mentioning like, you had to bring your penny per day, and I'm like, what?
Right.
Like, what are you talking
You
about?
start looking at this stuff and you're like, what? How did it work? Yeah.
Yeah. And then they started like subsidizing that, but through like random stuff like sin taxes
Yeah.
and insurance taxes, and like we still do in Georgia, where I'm from. Like there's a fairly progressive higher education grant. It used to be more than it is now. But how's it funded? Lotteries.
Yeah,
Um,
lotteries, or you'll have like fines and fees, tickets,
mhm,
and seizures.
mhm,
I'm in North Carolina in particular. There's a revenue stream for public education that comes from it comes from mass incarceration. It comes from fees associated with that. So yeah, yeah, and then famously in Philadelphia, the soda tax. You
mhm.
tax gambling, tax cigarettes. Um,
Gas tax is one of the things we use here. So,
gas tax. Yeah, I mean taxation. You sort of asked in your previous question too, like what does this sort of story of school finance say about the financing of public goods in general? And that's a very interesting question, because when you start to try to unravel what's going on in education, then you start seeing what's going on with water, with streets, with sanitation, public health, what how stadiums get built, and how higher education, universities, what their revenue streams are like, police, fire, like all of these parks, all of these provision, in the United States, all of the things that the left really wants to be able to provide on a massive scale, in a new way. The that flows, that finance these things, are arcane, decentralized, hyper local specific, with their own histories and their own practices and their own little strange boards and people who are in charge at different, like multiple layers of government. Not to mention the whole borrowing, the municipal bond market, and borrowing authorities that have emerged. Like, I was intimidated, and impressed in a sort of negative way at the
mhm,
sprawling, um, you know, kind of chaotic nature of this quote unquote system we have. I mean, I wouldn't even call it a system, because a system is a fantasy of an image that it's somehow all networked together, and it technically the flows all work out and everything gets to where it needs to go in the network or in the system. It's not how it is. It's an extremely uneven set of articulated and disarticulated structures that people don't really understand, that then comes to provide a good, and you get accustomed to the provision of the good the way that it's provided. But you lift up the hood and it's like, oh my god,
yeah.
to actually see the flows, and when something's going wrong, to be able to figure out, this is like being a mechanic to some degree. You have to figure out where the hell this thing is going, or where's the choke point, what happened, who dropped the ball where in the flow, or where could it be expanded. And I think there's a big disconnect between organizing and movements and those intricate kinds of policies, which I think then does the movements sort of disservice, because you lose moral and political legitimacy when you appear not to know what you're talking about. And you actually maybe make demands, and those demands maybe even are conceded in a negotiation through the other side that you're pressuring, but ultimately those demands were oriented at some other place in the structures that don't address what it is that you're trying to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is important. I mean, we'll talk about the bond market in a minute. You also your chapter 2 relates also to a piece you wrote in the Baffler about the likely problems that Zoran Mamdani is going to hit in New York eventually. He has so far managed to scare enough of the progressive part of the New York Democratic legislature and governor to get some, albeit probably extremely temporary and provisional, concessions, but he has gotten them. But I got obsessed with this kind of, I would almost say, metabolic as a metaphor way in which leftists hit walls with the national government for reasons of federation and everything else. So then they turn back toward things like sewer socialism, but have forgotten, the structures that were emerged to block it. I mean, like when I was trying to tell someone, like, when you talk about sewer socialism in the 1920s, public finance and the markets and the legal obligations of cities, and even how they handle that finance and who they tax and how they tax it, is totally different. And one of the things that you just have to deal with is, at the level of a certain level of sovereignty, and this is not a concept that I love, but we just have to talk about it. They have the right to print currency. They can base or debase, although there's no actual basis for base and debasement anymore. Their currency, it particularly in an economic hegemon that is at least of regional size. I think it's a little bit more complicated for small states to do this because they have to buy so much outside of their own production zone, but nonetheless. But when you think about how America is set up, the United States is set up, and actually Canada is kind of too, and so is Mexico, so maybe America's appropriate. Most of the funding for things that are necessary are hard to scale up because we fund them at the provincial, state, or municipal level, areas in which there is no currency sovereignty necessarily.
That's right.
So you can't decide to, like, debase, and that's for people listening in quotation marks, your currency to fund projects, even if it wouldn't lead to that much inflation, et cetera, et cetera. It makes in the United States, it makes the federal government kind of weird because it's like an insurance program that just murders a bunch of people. But it can't do a lot of the things that governments in Europe do around public goods, partly because there cannot even be a discussion constitutionally about the role of currency in that. Even though we inflate and deflate our currency all the time, it's for industrial policy. It is not for domestic social policy 99% of the time. There are a few exceptions, COVID being one of them, but in general, we don't do that. The other thing that you talk about is Wall Street bonds and munis. I got into a debate with some socialists when I read your first your Baffler article to my channel and talked about it. And I was like, there's a whole lot of levels of bonds, but one of the things you have to deal with municipal bonds is, even though they're municipal bonds, and even if you do price for the fact that they're a tax rebate, and that, because they're a tax rebate, there's ways in which it's smart for corporations to use them to offset their stock costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. most people don't understand this, but I worked in insurance before I became a teacher, so I kind of
There you
already
go.
did.
Then that'll give you some familiarity.
Right. And they're like, "Oh yeah, but you price for the tax rebate." I'm like, "But not completely." And also, there's more than one level of bonds. Municipal bonds aren't the only bonds being tied up into this.
Right.
And once you tie bonds into this, you are no longer dealing with local and domestic law. You are also dealing with international finance law and international treaty agreements. So,
Because the
which makes
investors in these bonds are across the world.
right. So they can sue your government, and have. So um, uh, I was surprised. I actually knew about this in general. I did not know that this affected schools as much as it does. Like, that was actually surprising to me. I knew this from studying, like, why did the Dennis Kucinich marriage go up in flames?
Yes, the Kucinich and New York City in '75 are talked about,
right.
in the literature as being big moments.
And then if you look contemporaneously, Brandon Johnson has hit this wall multiple times in Chicago.
That's right. That's right.
And it's actually dramatically affected his popularity. And but I was surprised how much it affects schools. Can you talk about how it affects schools? Because that was kind of a shock to me.
Yeah. Yes. Like what you were saying before, I just wanted to touch on, I think is a really important point and doesn't come up in conversations that I have around the book as much as, I would want it to, is the sort of, monetary theory, policy element of this, particularly like, the idea of sovereignty of a currency and the relationship of the federal government as the sort of monetary sovereign to its subnational governments, the states and the localities. I come at the book from a kind of semi modern monetary theory perspective. I wouldn't call myself a modern monetary theorist, but I have pretty deep sympathies with the outlook and a lot of the insights there that I think are basically right. But when it comes to the provision of these goods at the state and municipal level, what the insight does is it reveals and this is the image, actually it was in reading Scott Ferguson's book, Dependencies, a state of it's what is it again? Declarations of Dependence. It was in reading his book and like thinking about this, how to characterize philosophically this system, that it's a straitjacket because with the federal government able to print its currency and budget in the way that it could to provide all kinds of resources, even in this sort of very strange, as you said, insurance company that kills people. Like there's a book called American Bonds by Sarah Quinn, who's a sociologist, and she's her thesis, which I think has influenced me too, is that the way that the federal government works in terms of its policy making is essentially incentivizing state and local policy through credit conditions, right? If the federal government can offer credit incentives, borrowing incentives to make borrowing cheaper or easier, for states and localities to do a thing, that's how it legislates in the context of federalism. And that's how it's been able to influence things at certain points. And we even saw that, with the Biden administration, through the Inflation Reduction Act and other things. But now even in the second Trump administration with the National Voucher School program, National Voucher Program, it's the same. It's a tax credit program. So that element is coming back, and the fact that school districts, that's a sort of almost context or kind of prequel to the answer to your question of like how this affects schools. Everyone is sort of in this straitjacket because your school district, your public school district, most school districts in the United States have to borrow as borrowers, issue their own bonds as borrowers in the municipal bond market to get the liquidity that they need for infrastructural projects, high cost projects, things we call capital projects. If you're managing that school district, you need a new elementary school, you need a new HVAC system, you have to repair your schools after a climate disaster, you have to you have to put in new cybersecurity programs because your data has actually been hacked and ransomed for millions of dollars, as happens like across the country pretty frequently. You need to borrow now. where do you go to borrow? You go to this private credit market, which means you need your own consultants and lawyers, and you need a credit rating for your school district, and you need to issue a bond that you have to sell on a market at a rate of interest, promising to pay out a percentage yield to the bondholders who ultimately will buy your product, buy you as a product, and you have to pay them back with interest over long periods of time. You have to constantly refinance to try to take advantage of fluctuations in the interest rate. And like it puts these kinds of pressures on the school district. First kind of pressure, I think, is a huge, the debt service is on average between 8 and 10% of every yearly budget of a public school district. And even though it's 8 to 10%, that 8 to 10% exerts a incommensurately large source of anxiety for the school district budget official, because the rest of the 90% of the budget of expenditures will come to bear on what ends up being perceived as the quality of the education that the school district is offering, but also its fiscal responsibility. And if it's perceived to be fiscally irresponsible, it hurts the credit rating, which then makes it more expensive for them to borrow next time, which increases their debt service costs, which means that they can't allocate more money to the other 90% of stuff that they have to do, like salaries, materials, and the like. And or when they have to increase sales taxes and make people more mad by taxing them at the point of consumption with this excise tax, in the case of Georgia. Like the school district budget official has to worry any given change, could be a curricular change, could be any larger expenditure that typically movements and unions are always pushing for in their negotiations and in their demonstrations and in their actions. The district, and thus the superintendent and the school board, have to worry about their credit rating. Is their credit rating healthy? Are they going to be able to borrow? They use this as a cudgel to argue against so many different kinds of demands that, like that it is true to some extent that it exerts this pressure on them, but also like there's a lot more breathing room in the system, but it creates this game that they have to play where they're constantly measuring any given fiscal action against the possibility that it's going to impact the credit rating, that it's going to impact the borrowing costs, which then if your school district sinks a ranking on that credit rating, it could impact property values, which is ultimately your boss, right? Your boss are the ways in which the property owners in your school district are happy or not happy with the service that you are providing that would attract or repel people from purchasing and holding property within the boundaries of that district. If people don't think the schools are good, maybe they're not going to buy the houses there. And if they don't buy the houses there, the price of the houses go down. And if the price of the houses go down, you can't tax it to get as much money for your schools. Like it go on and on and on. But the other thing I think is it's so complicated that there are information asymmetries between the public servants who are just trying to keep the books for these school districts and trying to manage the fiscal situation of the provision of this public good, education, and the like roiling waves of energies and technical knowledge and complexities of credit markets. There is a huge informational asymmetry between the people who are responsible for planning, issuing, and then implementing and then managing the expenditures of these bonds and then repaying them, refinancing them, and the people who are on the side of the provision of that liquidity on the municipal market side and the credit market side. Like for instance, in the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, what was super popular? Variable rate instruments like auction rate sales, kinds of bonds. And those variable rate instruments where the interest rate of your bond changes weekly according to, at that time, LIBOR, which ended up being a big scandal. It was super corrupt. Now it's pegged to SOFR. Those bond statements, I've seen them in the school district of Philadelphia. Those bond statements take up 4 massive hardbound volumes. Literally, there's a bond statement that I think reaches 800 pages, trying to lay out the exact mechanics of how this variable rate instrument is going to work. public servants just trying to finance public education don't have all the information that the people selling these complex credit instruments, derivatives of various kinds, have. And that's the variable rate, but even the standard general obligation bond at some kind of market rate is so complicated to have to navigate that like stuff just slips through. People don't understand. They don't know their options. They don't know about, if it's bid out to underwriters, are they getting the best deal that they possibly can, or are they just using the bank that they've always used? How much is the underwriter taking in the discount in that? Like, it's a complete category mistake is how I think about it. To try to expect entities like a public school district to be able to operate in a rational, efficient, and generous way as borrowers on a complex credit market like this. And then ultimately, like the sort of pressures that all of this exerts come to bear on the ability of these public servants to provide the public service that they're supposed to. And then the other thing about it, the informational asymmetry in those who are actually having to engage it is one thing. The opacity of the system to those who are impacted by it, you and me, students, parents, school people in general, is a huge issue. People don't understand at all how this works. And sometimes those people are even becoming superintendents. They're running and winning school board seats. They're the ones actually with their fingers on the button to some degree to figure out how these things should be structured, and they never received any education about it. Which is why in the classes I teach bond statements, right? I just have my students read bond statements so that they can understand. When I was more active on Twitter before it was so terrible, people would reach out to me. I got a message from a superintendent in Indiana who was just like, I became superintendent and I didn't realize how much of my job was going to be taken up by trying to get bonds passed and then manage them. But I never learned about that. So how are you supposed to, like run this? So to me, we're talking about a $4 trillion market in municipal bonds, 27% of which are for education. Like it's a huge regime that comes to bear on education that I feel like nobody knows about.
Yeah. I mean, it was massive. It's more massive than I thought. Yeah. Actually, there's a parallel that I realized about like Kluges in education and in capitalist civic policy generally.
You said clues?
Kluges,
Oh,
like things that are just grafted on other things that are just grafted on other things, so no one can really like understand their complexity, and they can't retro engineer it either.
Right.
So I was thinking about this as legal regimes, like the bizarrety of legal regimes in special ed. If you've ever dealt with that, you probably
sure.
I'm sure you know what you do in policy, but like, and how that's tied up into like regional case law rulings, of which the people who are supposed to enforce this, school board members and administrators, know nothing about. I went and looked at the administrative requirements, to get your license as an administrator. It has one class on law,
That's right.
here in Utah. One. I will actually tell Georgia on this. As a teacher, I had 2 classes on education law.
Yeah, that's right.
But I was looking at this and I was going, okay, so the people meant to enforce rights can only do it by often relying on teachers who have slightly more education or more recent knowledge of the law, none of whom know the case law.
Right.
Like I like know some specific rulings and interpretations of FERPA between court districts just because I moved across the country.
You had to encounter it.
Right. But when I explained like, hey, and this court in this district court back south, this is interpreted in this way, particularly in light of the Civil Rights Act. Whereas out here, we're not under jurisdiction of the Civil Rights Act. And also your court interprets this as a completely different way. And it goes down like percentages of certain kinds of like disabilities you can have in a classroom at any given time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No one knows this. Now, you might go, okay, what does that matter? That is actually the explanation for the massive explosion in invisible administration in public schools, which is probably the largest cost increase that we have. People go, oh, that's bullshit jobs. That's just PMC serving PMC stuff. I'm not going to get into that.
Sure.
But it's not. What it is that nobody has the knowledge to deal with all the law. So they hire various specialists and subspecialists to handle each thing as it comes to them. But these areas don't necessarily talk to each other. Like the people who deal, like it's not an institutional review board, but we have an IRB like departments for research, both internal to ourselves and for when we work with academics. It has
in the district or at the school?
At the district level, right?
Yeah.
Like at the district, we wouldn't have one at the school level.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah.
But they don't know what the lawyer knows and what the sped specialist sub assistant dean or assistant super knows, and they're in communication, but they're not. I live in an actually fairly under administered in this way school district in Utah. Utah's kind of notorious for keeping that somewhat lean, and yet we have 4 buildings, 4 very larger than school campuses of just administrators at this point that we have to pay.
It's interesting.
And there's a strong incentive for teachers to become them because it's the only way to get at beyond a certain pay bracket at a certain point. And so this is an ever expanding cost that no one understands. They know about it in universities because it's on the price ticket. They do not know about it in public ed.
It's all lumped into salary expenditure. It's all and it said, well, we pay teachers so much. This actually becomes important with pensions, right? Because the pension the pension contributions and then defined benefits for superintendents, former superintendents, and administrators is orders a level higher than that of the beneficiaries like that are teachers. And so people say, oh, we're paying teachers so much. Very few of them, as you're saying, there are very few studies, at least that I've seen, break this out by administration versus teacher, right? They're not interested in the ways in which this class of educators, maybe generally speaking, is. But Althusser has this distinction that you do have to break the working class down into at least 2 subcategories: the people who toil and the people who goon them. So he calls them the goons and the toilers. And it's rare to break out the toilers from the goons when we're talking about salary expenditure in public education. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the more complex these policies, structures, and laws get in terms of their compliance, the more you have to hire people to kind of manage them. Those people who are managing them are actually the ones ultimately who are kind of in charge of whether or not such jobs like should exist. They don't want to they don't want to write their own jobs out of existence. So then you have this ever kind of growing sort of Tower of Babel kind of thing going on, where people are working on all kinds of different things that are arcane, have different kinds of knowledge, and you're trying to provide this good. And, the overall structure becomes pretty unstable, I would say.
My favorite stat to try to illustrate this to people, and weirdly, libertarians used to talk about this, then they realized it hurt their politics, so they shut up about it. They used to talk about it in terms of cost disease, but I would be like, but I would say, okay, the cost of educating a student, even adjusted for inflation, has doubled in the past 20 years. The pay of the average teacher has declined relative to that number. I know that there's been some studies, teachers might make more than beginning engineers. Yeah, that's true, because we've also been overflowed in the STEM fields with people by lying that we had a STEM shortage and creating an overglutted market. But nonetheless, that's but relative to what teachers made in like the 1990s was probably the high point. We've seen in real value decline, and yet the percentage of any taxes taken in that goes to payroll has been fairly stable at it between like 90 and 93% for I don't know, since we've really been like counting this stuff. And people go, well, then how is that true? How are teachers making? And I'm like, because there's this whole other category of workers that are not like office staff people. Those people make less than teachers. In fact, in my area, they're probably the lowest paid people. Like they make less than the average person who works at Target or Walmart. We're basically dependent on female retirees for those positions, are people who are married well. But so you have this entire complex where the people you interface with don't make that much money, are a teacher's gonna, like, I make about median income for the area, but less income for what my education requirements are, blah 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 blah. People know about this. But then they're like, well, why is school costing so much more? And I'm like, well, there's two reasons. One is the servicing of debt. Two is the servicing of contracts you don't know about. And then the biggest one is cost, disease, and administration, because of the complexity of managing the first two things: the contracts and the debt servicing and keeping up with it, and also legal compliance and documenting the legal compliance.
Oh yeah. The only other thing I'd add to that list is the retirement benefit.
Oh,
so
yeah.
The pension contributions post 2008 financial crisis, after the market tanked, all these pensions they're managed by people trying to fulfill what they understand to be their fiduciary duty, which is just to invest the money to get the highest return, to be able to get inflows into the pension. Not only were they got a wrecking ball in the form of that market crash, but then in the wake of that crash, the austerity that followed restructured the contributions to those pensions, such that the contribution requirements were much less the contributions were much less generous. The pensions were underfunded. There's much more liability, unfunded liability that the pensions require, and so you have to spend more and more on that to be able to pay out your defined benefits, which is a program I believe in. But certainly the cost of that goes up. In this sort of austere universe.
Yeah, well, in Utah, they handled that by, we have a defined benefit into a 401(b).
Yeah, of course.
Right. So they do give us a defined benefit. We're going to deposit this amount of money into a 401(b).
That's your defined contribution. Yeah,
right.
It's not it's not a defined benefit, right? Because you don't.
No, we can't insure it.
They just contribute to the account. They don't know how the market's going to go.
Absolutely. And so this is the situation that we're in. So like we have in Utah, if you entered in a certain year, you have a true pension. If you entered, I think in the aughts, you have a hybrid system. And if you entered after that, you can choose between like 30% defined benefit, 70% 403(b), or all 403(b). Because also, if you leave the state, you don't get your defined benefit. So and you're not vested for 4 years, which is specific because 50% of teachers quit at year 3. So
you vested 4. Vesting at 4 isn't bad, from what I know.
No, yeah, it's not terrible. In Georgia, it was 10.
10. Yeah, most people have 10, and then they create these new tiers where it's almost like you never vest, and that's how it is in New York.
And then the other thing is, I remember someone telling me that teachers have great medical insurance. I'm like, in all seriousness, it's the worst medical insurance I've ever had in my life.
The medical insurance cost now is going to go through. I mean, it's already, these insurance costs are already going up, because guess what? Post pandemic, a lot of people have many more medical issues than they did before, and so the costs are going up in terms of the premiums that and the school districts are paying, and that's coming out of the budget that needs to be going to salaries, materials, and other things too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was shocked. My paycheck does tell me what they actually pay into the full cost of my medical benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody's like, "Well, people." I was talking to a boomer recently, and they're like, "Well, people's employers pay that." I'm like, "I know no employer, including the state, that pays the full cost of the medical benefit." But also, let me tell you what that cost is. Between my portion and their portion, it's about $1,600 a month for a plan that is not stellar. You know, the lowest
Wow.
deductible you can possibly get is like $3,000. Most of them are
3,000. Okay.
yeah, most of them are $7,000.
7. What's the copay?
The copay varies, and there's co-insurance on everything, so you're always going the hook for at least 20% of the bill. Unless you hit your out-of-pocket maximum, which is like $20K. And
20K,
that's
which I mean they make it,
yeah. I mean, which is
craftification.
honestly, after I've seen some current ACA plans, isn't that bad, but it is not good. Like when
you wouldn't call that good, no.
And this, you know, some of it's I'm in a very red state.
Sure.
But I'm in a red state with a good economy, which is not the case like when you're in the Southeast.
Right.
To tie this in though, I also thought about this in terms of something that I've always noticed, and that's who got new schools and who got new school infrastructure.
Right.
Even out here in Utah, where none of the schools are super old, because, well, I mean, public services are nothing's that old. I think the oldest school we have here is like from the 1920s.
Right.
But most of the things were built in the 70s and 80s. But you can see that both because of we have this inner outer effect, which, you know, I mean, urbanists can talk about the gentrification, or our money coming back into the cities actually on a European side. And so we have these rings of suburbs that are dilapidated and rings of suburbs that are super nice. But what changes that from the old municipal model, and this affects schools too, is that at least you had the pooling of a lot of people together in cities. So you had infrastructure built for pooling. Like, and you still see this in a place like New York. But like out here in Salt Lake, you have rich areas, poor areas, rich areas, poor areas, and like concentric donuts. And since the poor areas are getting pushed further and further out from the city, you don't have any of the municipal capacity, like public buses and city trains and walkability, that you used to have even for urban people in places like Baltimore or New York City. And that means that also the cost for these poorer schools has gone up, and these schools are always old. So most of the schools of color where I'm at, and I know people think Utah is really white, it isn't.
Right.
Are like, you know, former farmer schools that were built in the 70s and 80s that now have mostly, let's say they're like 50% brown, more so Latin, indigenous, Polynesian out here, etc. And these schools are old. They do sometimes retrofit them. They do try to fix them up to some degree. But when there's a crisis, like in 2020, we got particularly hit. We got hit with a series of earthquakes in the middle of the pandemic.
Earthquakes.
Yeah, which also affected.
I write about that. Yeah,
the older schools more, which are more of color, which, you know, were built also for non-urban populations and now have urban populations in them. And so I was thinking about this when you were talking about like the infrastructure. It's really bad. Like when in urban areas in Georgia, you'll hit schools that are like they were built 120 years ago.
Right.
They have the last renovation was in the 70s.
Yeah.
And they luckily recently had air conditioning put in so people could go to school in August. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
and most don't.
Yeah, most don't. And you have all this, when there's new buildings in some of these school districts, these new buildings tend to go where the property taxes are, which means they go where the money is.
Right.
So there's newer facilities for the richer areas almost always.
Yep.
And what they do with the poor areas, and this is also because of this urbanization pattern I described, they just get the leftovers a lot of the time. They get the old, the school that was nice in the 80s, in the 1980s. Like, so, what have you seen with this? Because this really is, particularly as climate change and these buildings aren't equipped for their
Yeah,
environment.
that's right.
Rain messes up our schools here, and we have a
Sure.
lot of it now because we're not getting snow.
Yep.
Stuff like that.
And
Like,
I mean, to add a sort of insult to the injury, a lot of times school buildings are the crisis centers
mhm.
for catastrophes. And if your school building isn't well set up, then your crisis center is going to be susceptible to the crisis that you're trying to protect people from. This one of the stories I tell about Utah in the book, in the bond section.
Mhm.
I try to hit every state at least once in some way, but it's really difficult to do. But I did encounter a school district. I believe it was the Alpine School District, although I think the Alpine School District has been
It has been
merged or
broken up.
consolidated. It's been broken up. Okay,
Yeah,
so
it's the opposite. We have mega consolidated districts in the areas outside of the urban core in Salt Lake.
uh-huh.
And they're finally being broken up. Alpine is my neighboring district, so I know all about it. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, when you said earthquakes, it brought me to the story I tell about Alpine, right? Which is that there was a state report saying like, oh shit, the earthquakes endanger these schools, particularly the elementary schools. You better do something about it. So Alpine School District said, well, to get our schools safe from these earthquakes, we gotta renovate them. To renovate them, we gotta issue a bond. To issue a bond, we gotta have a bond referendum. To pass the bond referendum, we gotta get a supermajority vote of the property owners, taxpayers, the people who vote in these elections to be able to agree to it. Guess what? They voted it down. They didn't get the supermajority that they needed, and so the district was like, well, we can't make our school building, our little kids safe from earthquakes because we didn't get the vote we needed to go sell ourselves as an investment commodity on Wall Street. And so it ended up being that the school, like multiple other families who had like voted for the bond and wanted the renovation because they didn't want to send their kids to a school that wasn't earthquake safe, sued the school district, and the school district then had to pay legal fees to fight them in court.
Mhm.
Right, so the expenditure for the legal fees to fight the people suing them for not passing the bond is the expenditure, not the renovation of the school to make it safe for earthquakes. It's an example I bring up a lot, because it's just absurd. It's absurd. There was another school story of these school buildings falling apart. The stories are actually very, very deep, and school building stuff is actually some of the most vivid when you ask
Mhm.
people about actually school finance. But when you think, like very few of these conversations actually come up because the system of financing is so inscrutable. But there's a school that I think of from Ohio in the 1990s that was found to be sliding down a hill an inch a year, the whole building. And the way that they were trying to rectify this problem in Ohio was using that civil rights strategy of going through the courts. They got a court victory in Ohio that said, okay, you got to fix this. But essentially, what happens when you have a state Supreme Court case victory, if the plaintiffs win, then the judge or the state Supreme Court goes and points over at the state legislature and the governor and says, you got to do something about this. But it's not like the state police are going to go arrest the entire state legislature and the governor, for not doing anything. And Ohio sat on its hands for 14 years. They didn't do anything. So the school building continues falling down the hill. There's stories abound. Like, the story in the Pennsylvania state Supreme Court case that actually was just decided in 2023. There's a teacher out in a rural school district who could see the sky through a hole in the roof of the classroom. There was a story from a school in Virginia where a teacher wanted to make copies using the copying machine. It overloaded the electrical system, and then the lights went out in half the classrooms in the school. Flooding, mold, asbestos, like I mentioned before. It's like on the most recent Government Accountability Office report, we don't have good data on national data on how the school buildings are. Frankly, we have reports like the American Civil Engineers that comes out with a report card every 2 years that measures the expenditure gap. So they do pretty good work sort of assessing the needs of the infrastructure across municipal infrastructure, schools, electricity, whatever, and the needs versus the expenditure, and they come up with an expenditure gap, and then they rate it according to A through F. And the most recent one, the city's school, the country schools are, I think, a D or a C minus in terms of the gap between the expenditures and the needs. There's a new National Center for School Infrastructure, actually, that's headed up by Jeff Vincent, California. That's really cool. And they're going to start collecting this data, and the State of Our Schools report has started to do some of this stuff. But and if you want good reporting on it, American Schools and Universities has a newsletter, and they do reporting on bonds and school infrastructure stuff, and you can find out some of these stories. But it's I think the GAO report found that I think 54% of schools were in need of significant infrastructural repair in this country. And what I continually come back to on this is like there was a generation, a set of decades coming out of the Reagan administration that basically created this narrative, this discourse that said, well, the schools are failing, the test scores are bad. We basically need to put pressure on teachers and schools and threaten their funding to fix this problem. We need accountability, high stakes testing, and we need market solutions. We need privatization. We need vouchers. We need charters to fix this problem or whatever. But there was no talk of the facilities. Okay, there was no talk of how easy it is to breathe. There was in the school buildings. There was no talk of whether the light was good. There was no talk of whether or not there was good air turnover, whether or not there was mold, whether or not the ceilings were proper, whether or not the ventilation or the heating was proper, whether or not there was air conditioning. If you don't feel good, if you can't breathe, you're not going to be doing well on your standardized tests. If you're so hot you can't focus, that you get tired and sluggish, you're not going to be able to learn algebra or the state capitals or whatever the hell it is. And so I think basically the educational reform discourse just, this thing was right under its nose. It was staring at them right in the face. It was in the very walls, the drywall of this problem. But they didn't solve it at all. And so now we're left with these facilities that I think it became very much more apparent to people in the pandemic. They left the school building and they weren't in the school buildings for a while. And I think a lot of people felt better. they were like, why do I feel a little better? And I think it's because they realized that there was so much stuff going on in their school buildings that they felt differently about it. And this got a lot more attention because of airflow and air turnover and, and the like. So I think honestly, if there's gonna be a initiative that I think the left or maybe liberals at least in general should take, it's fixing up the buildings. That's one of the things I come down to in the book. It's let's rebuild. Let's have massive infrastructure projects, which I think matches nicely with the Green New Deal and decarbonization, because you can decarbonize, fix up the buildings, make them really nice, and then not put carbon into the atmosphere to ruin the future that you're supposed to be preparing the kids for.
Yeah, I think about when I have seen massive infrastructure investment, like in the Southeast, in schools, what we spend it on.
athletic fields.
No, I mean, yes, we did that too, but that was actually paid for by private money. By those massive booster clubs. Don't get me started on the massive
Oh,
booster
well,
club
yes,
thing.
yeah, the parent associations and the
Yeah,
booster clubs. Yeah,
well,
there's a
because
whole
they'll
sort of
spend,
shadow economy.
$1 trillion, it feels like, on football stadiums, and yet we can't get these same people to pay for any money for schools. But are in Utah, we have issues like we're not allowed to even we have to cover for extracurriculars, people on free and reduced lunch, their costs, but we're also not allowed to increase the charges on anybody else to do that. Which means that we just
School
kill
lunch is a whole thing.
programs. Yeah, we
Yeah.
just squash the entire program and it becomes a private program. But the building stuff got me, really thinking about it, because when I remember that they did some building restructuring in the Southeast in the 90s, you know what they did? They made those schools like prisons to protect against mass shooters or whatever. So like there's they all became security complexes.
That takes money too. I mean, now that's a huge realm of expenditures. Huge,
Oh
big
yeah.
business now.
Putting razor wire around the high school I started teaching at 20 years ago, and then making sure they had three locked entrances to come in through during the school day.
There's a great documentary called Bulletproof about school shootings and the security, the surveillance security required at a Texas school district that is really revealing what they're trying to do. And he's very clear that doesn't go deep into the finance of it, but they had to take out a whole bond just for that.
Right. I mean, I could think about all the money that we spent, even here in Utah, which is not as security focused. But they've done like we've done stuff like, as opposed to deal with other problems, we took federal grants and put divots in our walls, so that there's no straight line of sight, so that for mass shootings, which we have way too many mass shootings, but actually statistically it does not affect most students directly. It affects them indirectly by the fear of it.
The fear of it, yeah.
We have another weird expense. This is unique to Utah as far as I know. We give a one-time stipend to individuals to volunteer to carry a gun on campus, and it can't be faculty. And we just pay somebody $500 to have a gun and come on campus randomly.
Yeah.
We don't know who they are.
Yep.
That's an expense we have.
That's an expense.
I mean, because the legislatures will do stuff like this, or they'll do stuff like censorship boards or stuff like that, which also are an expense. I was telling someone, like all this weird culture war stunting we've done around schools, is incredibly expensive.
There was research published on it actually, and they estimated the cost of this, which includes security for school board members whose life is threatened. Because of anti woke stuff. People are scared of trans kids, so they threaten the lives of the school boards. I think it's around $3.5 billion. I think is the cost of that.
It's absurd. I mean, we have a cost of warehousing books that are censored because we cannot throw them out for fear that some kid picked them up randomly without their parents' permission.
Interesting. Yeah, warehousing.
Yeah, we warehouse. We instead of destroying and or throwing away or remaindering books that are banned, we have to box them up and warehouse them at our expense.
Yeah.
So I find that people just like, they have no idea what we're like, some of the absurd things we're wasting money on doing by legislative fiat. It's not stuff that schools would choose to do.
It's called unfunded mandate. Is the term for it. There's a ton of unfunded. I mean, every time there's another demand for a school district to do something, and there's no extra line of funding for it, it's an unfunded mandate.
So we can get to the positive part of your book a little bit.
Sure.
I want to jump to chapter 5 before I get to chapter 4, because this was something that I liked your vision for, but I currently hate. So
Okay.
I'll tell you what I mean by that. Um, I like the idea of the school as a public site. I hate that currently that is how we backdoor do social safety systems, where I personally need to be a psychologist, an EMT, um,
The
and
community school idea.
yeah, like I'm big on schools as social centers, but I have had to be an EMT. Like,
Yeah.
luckily, I had corrections training from a bad career I don't ever talk about. Even before that, so I knew CPR, but I've had kids have heart attacks in my classroom. Like, and we didn't have a school nurse. We had a district
Right.
nurse, and they were 45 minutes away. So, like, it was my job to keep this kid alive for 45 minutes.
Wow.
Which I had zero formal training on. Or excuse me, no, I got told how to use a defibrillator once and not to touch blood. Um, you know, that you know, like, so that was my second year as a teacher. That was a long time ago, but like,
That's how about that beginning for the career?
yeah, our trauma informed pedagogy are trying to make sure these kids eat, which we're also
Yep.
constantly dealing with the fact they're clawing that funding back. It like when the federal funding ended, like public school kids who choose to go online, they don't get food now because the federal funding ended, and now they're like, oh, we don't have to give it to them.
Right.
And it is bizarre to me how this plays out, and it plays out in weird ways. So, for example, for all the talk about people needing to pay their own way, one of the richest districts in Georgia and outside of Augusta, it was also used as a model for 100% free and reduced lunch schooling and best practices, but it was deceptive because it was a school district that had 100% free and reduced lunch because there was a nuclear power plant in district, and the nuclear power plant's settlement with the city was that the Georgia Power was going to pay for everyone's lunch for forever, but the average income there was actually $30,000 higher than the rest of the state. So not only did it lead to completely misleading best practices, which they were using it as a best practice model school deceptively, but it was technically 100% free and reduced lunch. I remember arguing with people about the need for kids to pay for their lunches, and I'm like, but some of the richer public schools have free lunches for whatever reason, and these schools that already have 50-60% free and reduced lunch can't get it for the remaining 30 who make way less.
Sure.
And this is not a major cost. It is, I mean, it's like a couple of million a year for most districts, and I'm like, why are we insisting upon this, particularly now that like I don't school lunch inflation, for example, is a weird thing to be obsessed with, but like,
Yeah.
it was relatively stable from the mid 90s to the middle aughts. So like school lunch actually was only 25% more when I started teaching in 2007 than when I graduated in the late 90s.
Yeah.
It is now like $5.
Right.
And I understand some of that's inflation, but some of that cost increase was way before the inflation spikes of the 2020s. So this is maddening to me that we can't handle this. Or that we have to means test this in absurd ways.
Yep.
So I'm with you on the social anchors. I hate that because we're understaffed and because these are unfunded mandates, it just kind of becomes my job as a teacher.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking about where it is that I recommended that, because I actually I have a similar skepticism of that. I don't know if is that in
I think we were
the
talking
federal.
more about the schools as social centers, not in the way that I'm talking about, more in the way of like, we could build this out more publicly and we could build this infrastructure and like put the people there to do it. That's what I took from this chapter.
Oh, I see. I mean, I think the way that I think about that, the way that I at least tried to write about in the book, is more like, it's more about the school buildings themselves and how we finance them, making them more public, and trying to make them, sites where people are proud of the structure, that is their school, and This sort of gets to like an initiative that I was a part of in the pandemic, when the municipal liquidity facility was, in existence,
Mhm.
and it sort of blew everyone's minds that the Federal Reserve could actually lend directly to municipalities, at whatever terms they decided. It was one of my like sort of coming of age moments in school finance, was like sort of watching that happen in real time, and just like when I was understanding what the bond market was and how it worked, and then seeing during the pandemic that, oh yeah, like 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Charter, you could create a structure that just lends directly,
We
and
just
whatever,
don't.
you could have the lowest cost, zero cost, longest term loan from the federal treasury, and it's just fine. We just choose not to, because there's a like a fraction of the ruling class that makes a really good buck on borrowing and lending to municipalities like public school districts. I mean it, and so I was like, at that point in 2020, the discourse around the Green New Deal was still
Mhm.
very hopeful and visionary. It was only a couple years after AOC occupied a Pelosi's office. You remember that with
Mhm.
Sunrise, and she made a big stink in her first year, and like everyone was just like, we only have 12 years left, we're going to get this done, we need radical transformation. And there was a genre of writing that came out that I thought was very compelling, which was to envision how good it could be if we did a massive decarbonization industrial policy that fixed up our public infrastructure,
Mhm.
made it healthier, safer, and cleaner. And not only that, but taking advantage of the pandemic moment, particularly with school buildings, when people weren't going to the school buildings and they were unoccupied. To, and particularly with these new kind of groundbreakingly generous, provisional, not provisional, but in the sense of providing resources directly, from the federal government through the Federal Reserve and through, pandemic relief and the like, how good would it be if this were good? Like, if there were suddenly now crews coming in and like renovating these old buildings that people had gotten so used to seeing in, and they were new and they were clean and decarbonized, there would be a sort of, uh, I tried to write about it and talk about it from almost this affective kind of joy and pride. And obviously employment increases, and the like. And there was a sort of this kind of positive, visionary, imaginative
Mhm.
way of writing about it. And in terms of, that's in the book what I call the Green Dream. Which comes from Pelosi's critique of the Green New Deal. Like that, I think that's what I was imagining. I think that's the image that
Yeah.
I'm getting from what you're talking about. Not necessarily that community school thing, which is one approach. But I completely agree with you that what we do in this country, and part of my reading of Althusser was a rereading of social reproduction theory. And the
Mhm.
main punchline of social reproduction theory is that like schools don't make society better just as schools. Like, schools reproduce society as it is. If you want
Mhm.
society to change, you have to fix society. Okay, schools essentially get used as a kind of like, it's a distraction. It's a distraction of the meritocracy to say, like, if everyone just has great schooling, then they're going to have great jobs, and they're going to have well-paying jobs, and we're going to be able to take care of their families. Like, so then you load everything on the school when you have this fantasy of opportunity and meritocracy. You think we just have to have good schools or whatever, but what that does is it creates an excuse that you don't have to have good transportation, you don't have to have good healthcare, you don't have to have good housing, you don't have to have good unions, and solid industrial policy, you don't have to have good sanitation, and the like. The school, if you can just make it all at the school, but that just then puts everything on the teacher, like you're saying. It is not
Yeah.
the teachers, it is not the school's responsibility to save society. It can't be. That's just an excuse for adults not changing society. It's a displacement onto the future. It's a kind of way of pushing it off. um, so I, yeah,
Yeah.
I completely agree with you there.
I mean, to me, it makes schools. Schools are always a side of ideological. I'm going to use some Althusserian language
Yeah,
for my Althusserian heads. Schools are always a side of the ideological apparatus of a particular society and or state. But and they're highly contradictory when in liberal society, because we're great equalizers and meritocrators, but we're also the great sorters of society into the various classes, and gets to decide who gets to move up and down, if they're anybody at all,
right.
or who gets the illusion of being able to move up and down. As I tell people, I'm like, on paper, I've actually moved 2 social classes above my parents, but in terms of actual reproductive capacity, no, I have not.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it actually becomes a Red Queen game where we just run in place and make it look like we're making social advancements because we have a white collar job or whatever, but we don't even have the purchasing power of a factory line worker in the 50s.
Sure.
And
Which a school can't provide. It is impossible for a school to provide that wage. That is not, the school cannot do that. There's a relationship between the school and the division of labor. The school prepares the person for a division of labor that is thus and so. It's not as though the school creates some kind of new division of labor where the wages are distributed in some different way necessarily. No. If anything,
right.
an overeducated populace, that is to say, a mismatch between the educational levels of the populace and a division of labor that's meant to receive these educated individuals, that's going to create wage depression, right? It's going to create lower wages because of the cost of the education. There's fewer jobs, being provided with those. Like, it's the credentialing process and the relationship to the division of labor is all out of whack.
Yeah, it's weird because Cleodynamics / overproduction of elite people almost get onto this, but then they blame it on elite overproduction and not a flaw in how you are aligning social reproduction in the first place.
This concept of the elite is extremely toxic. I'll have to say, for your listeners, it's the way, and I don't know. I know that Bruce Robbins has written something about this, and I don't know when it's going to come out. It is an excellent critique of the concept of the elite, which essentially removes class structure from the critique of power, such that now what constitutes an inequality is just whoever appears to sort of reproduce a certain kind of narrative or discourse. It has nothing to do with the material distribution. So when you have people like Steve Bannon or Barry Weiss looking like this kind of populist critique of the elite or whatever, that it completely divorces the material substrate of the actual inequalities into a fantasy that helps them to target the liberals and the left. It's an extremely dangerous kind of concept that we really need to interrogate, and that I think Pierre Bourdieu has some responsibility in manufacturing and interpretations of Bourdieu, right? Right-wing interpretations of Bourdieu and the concept of cultural capital and distinction. When you create an ambiguity with respect to the material realities and the conditions of existence, then suddenly you can just sort of divorce any critique from what actually people have their hands on in terms of resources. And I think that critique is spot on.
This is a digression, but not only do I agree with you, this is one of my critiques of quote PMC theory, and in addition to it being incoherent, because I can't figure out what singular mode of production the people being called PMC actually engage in that don't also overlap people who aren't some non-PMC or have some other function. But yes, I there is a truth to like that idea of a labor aristocracy, and like you said, toilers and gooners. I mean, there's truth to that. That's real. But that's not really what PMC ends up being used for. And you even have social democrats sounding like professors are the people who really run society, or even HR department for the people who really run society. And I'm like, look outside. What stops Trump for doing Trumpy things? And it's usually when the bond market falls.
Right.
And they're like, individual capitalists might be afraid of him. Yeah, but like capital as a whole is not.
Yeah.
and that's something that people have to grasp when it comes to schools and stuff too. Like, this absurdity, like even doing class analysis in this country is very hard, because like you'll look
Yeah.
up working class. And I remember a study that was even like taken on face value by Jacobin magazine, talking about working
Sure.
class versus non-working class people, but it was in total Weberian terms, meaning about
Mm.
access, because they talked about non-working class people in the same jobs as working class people. And I'm like, oh, so you mean college and non-college educated, but it's not about
Yes.
what
Yeah.
they're
Oh
doing.
God. The
It's about
conflation
their
is so.
possibility of moving, because of credentialing. Like,
This is
what are
this
you
is
talking about?
definitely an under critiqued area, which is the use of educated and uneducated as a proxy for class status, which it is very difficult to measure otherwise. So it is sure if you're out there creating discourse like Jacobin is, etc. But when those reports come out and they're just using college educated as a stand-in, it's like no, that's not that does not map to this class structure at all. It's an important issue. I just wanted to say I will have to jump off
Mhm.
at 45.
Okay.
Um,
So I'll ask you the last question then.
yeah.
You have two chapters on changing finance and also organizing. Can we talk about what you would see as a like minimum program for demands in finance, and then how should we organize and then push beyond that? So
Yeah.
that'll be my final riff question.
It's a great question. So minimum program. Well, I think I mean, we were so close to the Green New Deal for schools in that sort of froth of the budget reconciliation of 2021, 22. Like, it was maddening, actually, when the
Mhm.
Progressive Caucus got a spine and suddenly was fighting and, was going to try to, they were trying to do let's do the BIF, the bipartisan infrastructure deal first, and then we'll do the Build Back Better legislation after that. And they were like, no, we're not going to do that. And like, to me, the minimum program is the stuff that's laid out in the Green New Deal for schools at the federal level. Like, it's just an infusion of grants and loans. I did help write a very small part of that legislation that incentivizes the formation of tax-based sharing programs like they do in the Twin Cities, which I think is one of the only actually existing redistributive municipal finance, socialistic kinds of policies that actually exist in the United States at this moment.
Mhm.
It's one of the more powerful ones. It's one of the only what I would call collectivist, decentralized, redistributive policies at the subnational level that we have, and I think that encouraging that kind of tax-based sharing setup. I mean, you can set the dials differently wherever you want to do it. So, for instance, there's a little bit of conversation in New York City right now, where I'm based, about the sharing of parent association money, across schools, which can be extremely different. What would it be like to pool parent association money and redistribute it? And obviously, the sort of knee-jerk reactionary approach to redistribution is like, oh, well, don't take what's mine to give it to them. I don't like them. They're lazy. They're blah blah blah. And I worked hard for my money. I'm not going to give it to them. But tax based sharing is a redistribution of the growth in revenues, depending on the shifts in revenues across a sort of a region or area. And
Mhm.
I think it's got a great story. It's had success in the Twin Cities. And I think that if we can find ways of proposing that, forcing that conversation, we're going to make some headway. Now, how do you organize around that? Excellent question. When I was in the Philadelphia area and I would bring up tax-based sharing, everyone would look at me with like a what kind of look on their face. And there's a reason tax-based sharing elicits that opinion. The book that was written about the history of that formation literally is called "How Could You Do This?" um, like, what you have to start doing is getting people to work together across these boundaries that racial capitalism inserts and enforces in our society, that are extremely potent, extremely local, but I think that they are transgressible. I think that one can work across them. And one of the stories I tell in the book at the end of the bond section comes from the early 20th century and the construction, the financing of Conestoga High School in the Tredyffrin Easttown School District in Pennsylvania. And here you had two districts, very differently racially and class compositions. They entered into a jointure to assume the risk and the liability of the loan that was needed to take out to build this high school. And they built an integrated high school in 1909. In the early 1912 in Pennsylvania. And the more that we can create moments of financial jointure that then lead to, I would say, tax base, all kinds of revenue sharing. And I think credit, there needs to be sharing. That's one of the flaws of that system that I found in my own research of it in the Twin Cities, that there's no sharing of the debt that municipalities go into. Then like in New York, we're now like trying to start this conversation. You have to create jointures between catchments of schools, right? The schools have their catchment boundaries, and those lines, there's all kinds of stuff that gathers, all kinds of the energies of racial capitalism gathering at those lines, the wealth, the demographic distributions of neighbors. Like, you have to create jointures across these lines and then create tax-based sharing programs to do it. Another story that I don't tell in the book, but I didn't know exactly where it would fit. But there's a great movie about it, and I always forget the title of the name of this movie. But it was produced by Viola Davis, and it has Sam Rockwell in it, and it's the story of Durham, North Carolina, during integration, when there was an effort to integrate the schools across the county and the city lines, where the proposal to integrate the schools was essentially to create a jointure between a largely white and white supremacist community and a largely black, working class community, to try to comply with the Federal Circuit Court's findings with respect to Brown versus Board of Education. And the movie is an amazing story about something called a charrette that was created, a 3-day community meeting critique that was led to figure out how to get to compliance with the Federal Circuit Court and create that jointure. And it's an amazing story of a KKK leader in North Carolina, who is the representative, essentially, of the white community, who's against the jointure, becoming colleagues and collaborators with the head of the NAACP in Durham, a black woman. And it's about the relationship that they create, and ultimately his turn, where he comes to like basically renounce his KKK membership in his community and support the jointure because of what he sees in his interactions with the NAACP and the organizing, in his personal relationship with the organizers. That's the kind of stuff we have to do in terms of organizing, to answer your question. And I think we have to address these boundaries. Like, it's all well and good to have a Green New Deal for schools, fight for a Green New Deal for schools, and then elect exciting candidates like Zoran, whose campaign I helped with, and I'm a ride or die for Zoran. But like, you can't just run a successful campaign. Actually, just like the bond market, just like these taxation systems, just like all the stuff we've been talking about, there is an entire chaotic set of disarticulated structures that we have to take on to be able to create a kind of American collectivism or socialism. And the more that we can confront those boundaries, create the conditions for jointures that then lead to kinds of sharing and pooling, I think that's how we do it. And the policies that I write about in the book are part of what I call at the end, in the conclusion, a plan for public education, which lays out all the policies that I recommend. There's the tax-based sharing program, but then there's Vermont Act 60, which creates high floors for mill rates, low ceilings for per pupil expenditure, and a redistribution of the difference at the state level. I think that having a VAT tax could be good at the federal level if you want to create revenues I think we need to actually think about per pupil allocations for Title I, not just appropriations. You can't just be talking about doubling, tripling the appropriations for Title I. You have to talk about the per pupil allocations. We need a national investment authority that actually assumes the risk for financing collective goods at the federal level as a third pillar alongside the Treasury Federal Reserve. And we need, we need obviously the Green New Deal for schools, but also I think we could have fiscal mutualism where pensions purchase school bonds. So if you have teacher pensions purchasing school bonds and becoming the underwriters, you can use the public's money to take up and take on the private bank underwriters that currently determine so much of the flows for the infrastructure. So that's not a basic plan that I laid out, but that's sort of my overall plan. But if I was answering your question about, a basic plan and organizing, I think it's jointures and sharing and the creation of the conditions for the confrontation of these subnational, hyperlocal boundaries that separate us.
These are all good demands. I think it's important that we get really creative, and I do think if you're going to make socialist demands and you want anything like a minimum or transitional program, you actually have to know how finance works.
Yes.
And that's remarkably difficult to do. I mean, I know a great deal about economics, and I've, and like you're talking about here, and I learned stuff from your book, and I thought I knew a lot of the stuff, So thank you for coming on. Where can people find your work, David?
Yeah, so across social media, I'm School Daves, at School Daves. Okay. So I'm on TikTok. I have a surprising following on TikTok where I take requests to do school district analyses. But I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky. I have a newsletter. If you go to Linktree, I can send you my Linktree. I have all these links. Link to my newsletter and stuff. But look me up, School Daves.
All right, and I'll have you send me on when you have time that Linktree, and I'll put in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was great. Really fun.
All right, bye-bye.